First off, I'd like to introduce Burr Stewart, who is a fantastic modeler, and he's going to talk about his model railroad and some information about what he really enjoys about our hobby. So Burr, welcome. I really do appreciate you being with us this evening.
Welcome, everyone. I'm going to give you a very quick layout tour of a large layout that I've been building for 35 years. My name's Burr Stewart, and I'm going to basically take you through my modeling process rather than photos of each detailed scene. But by way of introduction, I just want to say this is me before I found out that I was very myopic and needed glasses. So I loved playing with trains, but I had to get real close up to them. And I've been playing with trains my whole life and just can't seem to stop. And just as an introduction, I have three very important quotes I want to share with you. One is from Kent Sullivan, who's a noted Northern Pacific historian. 95% of historical railroad photographs are about locomotives. And to me, the hobby really is about locomotives. And there's all kinds of other stuff that we do. But he found in his historical research that he could hardly ever find pictures of buildings or line side structures or bridges or anything. It was always photographs. The next thing that I always say is I never saw a train or a track switch that I didn't like, and I would call it beautiful, no matter how ugly it actually was. And Scott Calvert said to me one time, I started out designing my layout, and then at some point it started designing me. And I totally understood what he meant by that, because now I'm making all kinds of decisions that actually my layout is making, and I'm just sort of following its lead. So with that, we'll just start with how did I get going on this. In the early 70s, there was, of course, as you all know, a major merger. It's been called the most successful merger in United States business history. It was the merger of 4 railroads into the Burlington Northern that served the northwest corner of the country. And you're all familiar with this. And of course, it took them 7 years to repaint all the locomotives that they had from the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, and the CB&Q. It took them 7 years. So being a locomotive junkie, I thought, well, what if I picked 1973 to model, and then I could have literally 5 times more locomotives than I would otherwise need, because I have to run all sorts of different what are called rainbow consists. And this is a good example: Northern Pacific, SP&S, and Great Northern, as well as, of course, the new BN paint. So you see my mischievous thinking all from the start. And this is the current layout. I just took this picture this morning, and you can see what I'm talking about. We have the passenger NP scheme. Here's the freight and Northern Pacific. This is a Milwaukee caboose because the Milwaukee interchanged with the Burlington Northern in Seattle. The old CB&Q paint. You see what I mean? You can go crazy with this stuff. And I have. So the first step is sort of how did I get interested in this? And I do a lot of rail fanning. I lived in Seattle since 1979, and I would go to the main yard there and see all these weird things like open doors on box cars. Where is this car going if the door is wide open? Obviously and empty. I saw a train one day like this, beautiful GP30 on the front, switch engine in the middle, which was dead in tow, I assume. And then, a caboose with a big P. Well, what does a big P mean? There's just one question after another. And here was another train I saw that day with a bunch of really weird looking cars. Well, I found out later that these were aircraft parts cars going to the Boeing 737 assembly plant in Renton, Washington. They called the train the Renton Rocket. And of course, now we model it on our railroad, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. I also noticed a bunch of rebar, which is used, of course, in construction. And I didn't know anything about why it would be there and where it was coming from. But I learned more recently that there is a steel mill in Seattle that in my era used to be owned by Bethlehem. And it makes rebar from scrap metal all over the country because the electricity prices are cheap here. and ships a lot of it by rail, and they certainly did in 1973. I also noticed a lot of grain cars, and I was wondering, were they full grain cars, empty grain cars? What was that all about? And of course, I had to show you this picture since a lot of you are from the East Coast. I took this picture myself, and there was a Conrail engine in it. And how could that make sense? Of course, I learned later it was a pool, locomotive and pool service, and that's a normal thing. But here's another example of a thing that got me curious, a switch engine with a big bump in it. And of course, if any of you are Union Pacific fans, that's a rebuilt engine. And they didn't do this rebuild until later in the 70s, but that's all right. And, another thing that I just wanted to mention is, as a modeler, am I modeling the cars here, or am I modeling the activity of loading and unloading the cars? And this is on the layout here. I have this same team track. And the answer, of course, as you all know, is both. We're modeling both the cars, the locomotives, the scenery, and the operations. This is the east extent of my layout, which represents, I like to call it Chicago, but it's actually the Skykomish Yard, which is part way up the mountains heading east from Seattle. And I just get a thrill every time I see this picture, thinking about how I'm looking at, I guess I'll get to that later, but a lot of horsepower and a lot of rolling stock all ready to play with. So having, explained how I got interested and curious, now I'm going to talk about figuring it out. So the first thing, of course, is where are we? And we're in the northwest corner of the country of Washington State. And this yellow line is the Canadian border. And there was the Great Northern Railroad in red and the Northern Pacific in green. And after the merger, they were all one railroad. And then, of course, this orange color is the Milwaukee Road. And there were also some Union Pacific trackage rights that went up into Seattle. And of course, the next thing is, what can I build in my lifetime? And this is the track plan from the RMC article in January of 2008. And this shows the profile of the basement, and it's 30 feet from this side to this side, and it's about 33 feet from this side to this side, with the narrower part being about 24 feet wide. So that's the extent of the playground. And then there are these immovable furnaces and chimneys here. So I doodled around with track plans and concluded the best approach was to put a peninsula in the middle. Now, the most important story about track planning for this layout is that my wife and I really enjoyed playing ping pong, and so we had room in here for a ping pong table. And my wife insisted that we continue to be able to play ping pong. And we did for a while, and then I lifted the ping pong table leaves up and used it as a bulletin board for a while. And then eventually we got rid of it, because as we got more and more complicated building the layout, we needed more and more operators, and the operators need room. So we now have a nice little small table in the middle here with some chairs, and we have all the supplies for managing the operating session, and people can walk around and have decent room. So even though I could have filled the entire room with bench work, I'm so glad that my wife insisted that we keep this ping pong table so that we would have the option in the future, because I certainly had no idea it would turn into such a monstrosity. So how do you make sense of all this? This is a simple diagram simply showing that I was going from the north to the south to the east, and there's even a car barge that goes to the west on the Milwaukee. And I adopted this color scheme for helping route traffic so that the cold colors go to the north, the blue as the color of ice. The hot colors of red, orange, and yellow are to the south. And of course, purple is the color of royalty. And the headquarters of the Burlington Northern was way back east in Minneapolis. So The purple means east to us. And well, and so that was one way of making sense of it, to have a color scheme that people could learn and remember. I stole this idea from an OPSIG magazine. If you don't know that, that's the Operations Special Interest Group of the NMRA. And there was an article that somebody had come up with a simplified diagram. And at every station, I have the particular station in black in this center, so you can tell where you are on the schematic. And I can just tell people, for example, if they're switching here in the Balmer yard, which is the main yard in the layout, I can tell them you can send everything that's green and blue to the left, and send everything that's a warmer color than that, just send it to the right. And that works for any of these stations and makes it much simpler. I also have a narrow gauge layout in the center of the room, which I'm not going to really talk about today other than to show you one picture of it. But that's a whole nother presentation we could do on narrow gauge. So then each car, now that we have a color scheme, gets a car card and a waybill. And I won't go into that if you don't know what it is, but this is the stack of car cards that belong to this set of cars. And the purple says they're supposed to go towards Minneapolis, which in this case is the gravel quarry in Snohomish. I'll point out here too, I also always have locomotive cards with showing which functions do which things on the locomotive. That's another subject we could talk about. Then each track gets a box for car cards and work surfaces for organizing things. There's a list of different jobs on what's called the call board. So when people come in, they can sign up for different jobs they want to do, whether it's being a yard master or a switch crew or a local crew or a pool crew. And then there are a whole bunch of train instructions. We don't generally run more than 10 or 15 trains in a few hour session, but we have a lot of trains we can run. This is just a close-up of the kinds of things in a train instruction. And these are the same size as the car card, so it's easy for everybody to keep their paperwork with them. I'm not sure there's anything else I want to say about this. I hope you don't mind me going so fast. I just want to show you a lot of fun things. So this is a sequence of trains that we try to run that I pretty much stole from a timetable from the Burlington Northern in 1973, but I did make a few adjustments just to make sure that it made sense on the model. And of course, Jim, as you know, that's a whole subject. We could have a panel on that sometime of when is modeling the prototype no more fun, is no longer fun. How do you balance between having fun on the layout because it's a model railroad and copying the prototype exactly? And I won't, say more about that right now, but that's a great subject because I'm in the process now of retreating from trying to do everything just like the prototype and making it more like, how can we make this as fun a time for everyone as possible?
Bert, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Because it ties in, I think, to where you were going here. How long does it take for a person who wants to come to one of your operating sessions? How long does it take for them to break in, to have some idea about what they're doing?
Well, that's a good question. One could say years, right? But I think it's a good question. I think it takes at least a half an hour, 45 minutes. We had an operating session yesterday, and it didn't really get underway until about 35 minutes after the start time because people were just wandering around with a dazed look on their face, And eventually they all had their clipboards with their train instructions, and they had some idea of which way was north and that type of thing. So this just shows that we do put the information for them on the clipboard and give them a throttle. And physical and electrical reliability, of course, has also been the subject of many of your clinics on your channel. And I won't go into that now other than to say that I really overdid it with installing an awful lot of circuit breakers. But the great thing about that is anytime anybody makes a mistake and shorts out a block, it's only a little block that doesn't affect anyone else. And so the room full of 8 or 10 people continues going even though one person made a mistake with a switch. And of
Thank
course,
you.
you do have to make a bit of space for a dispatcher's desk, which I never thought of
Yeah.
in the beginning, but we did figure out a way to do it and rig up a couple of sort of what's the word? Well, let's just say that one of the projects on my list is to improve the closed circuit TV. But this is the one hidden staging yard that goes towards Portland, Oregon, and this up here is the staging yard behind Dave Enger's head. There, it's a camera train that I have aimed at the Sky Comish staging yard.
I got you.
And of course, we have to have people to run the railroad. So that's a whole nother modeling project, which is just to find people who are interested. And it hasn't been too hard. A lot of people have come to me, and it's partly because I have a YouTube channel now, and a lot of people are looking at my YouTube videos about the layout, and they are interested in coming to operate. You might recognize this guy here. This is Tony Thompson, who's the famous freight car guy from Berkeley, California. And he was here this year for the Sound Rails Operations Weekend, which is always a fun event. And I just wanted to show that I pretend to be organized, that this is a mind mapping software that I use to keep a list of all the things I need to do before an operating session. But in truth, I don't use it much anymore because I just leave the layout in a good shape, so it doesn't take too much preparation. My inner professor had to just share this one diagram with you that I think is pretty interesting, which is as modelers, we tend to think first about locomotives and then cars and track. And I happen to love all three of these things, and they're a lot of fun. And of course, you put them together into a train and you want to run it somewhere. So then you grudgingly start doing operations, because otherwise where are the trains going to go, right? But the way that a real railroad thinks is, who are the customers that are going to pay me money to keep this railroad running? And so they're much more focused on what does the customer need. If Boeing's making airplanes, do they need parts? Do they need them right now? Do we need to expedite and put that railroad parts car on the front of a passenger train so it gets to Boeing in time? It's that kind of thing that they're thinking about as the customers. So the track locomotives, all this stuff is just a means to an end for them. And I'm continuing to try to think of how to sort of slowly shift the way we're running the railroad so that it feels like we care about these customers. And that would be a whole nother presentation, because we've got some interesting and big customers on the layout, and we're thinking about how to make them a little more visible and have them participate in the discussions, if you will. And actually, I was talking to one guy the other day who has a friend who's an actor who loves to call in during the operating sessions and give somebody a hard time about how come such and such hasn't been delivered to them. And it lends a certain air to the thing when you have somebody on the phone who's demanding that you do something different than what you're doing. And I don't want to talk anymore about operations, but just other than to show this picture, which is, I told you, this is a picture of the Renton rocket on my layout coming up from the Boeing plant in Renton. And it's got the empty Boeing parts cars. They call them tool cars on the railroad. And it also has some scrap left over from the manufacturing process. This gets sent back to Alcoa, Tennessee. So that'll have to go up to my purple staging yard, right, to get back east. But as important as this is the international passenger service to Vancouver, BC. So what's going to happen right here is the dispatcher is going to hold this train right here and let the passenger train come out of the coach yard and go to the passenger station and pick up the passengers and get going. So that's the kind of thing that happens when you're doing operations. I already showed you this, but I have to say, I just love locomotives. Have I said that already 3 times? I mean, this is 50,000 horsepower right in front of your eyes there. How about that? So this is the middle of an operating session, and this is the main yard. And just to illustrate how much fun and chaotic it can be, I just wanted to throw this picture in. This is the engine terminal, and you can see it's gotten so clogged that we had to take some locomotives off the track and just stick them on the bare dirt there. And what else can we see here that's kind of funny? Well, there's too much in here, obviously. That's the main thing. This is a switcher, so he's probably trying to pull these cars out, but he's not sure where to put them. And meanwhile, this train. Anyway, you got the picture. This is Don Morenzi. I don't know if any of you know Don, but he's got an absolutely gorgeous layout in the East Bay, San Francisco Bay Area. And he is quite an expert in mining of all kinds. And when he was here for one of the sound rails, I gave him the loaded unit coal train, and he was just in heaven. And this great smile on his face is one of my favorite photographs ever laid out, because I knew how much he knew about mining and coal, and he was just in heaven. And of course, at the end of the operating session, 20 hours later, we have all cabooses facing us instead of locomotives, because the locomotives are on the other end heading towards Chicago. And this 20-hour thing is my main point, which is I had no idea when I started the layout that it would take 20 hours of continuous operation of 10 people to get everything done. So now we have 3 or 4 hour op sessions where we can have 4 or 5 of them in a row without any restaging because we haven't gotten the job done yet. But it's a lot of fun. Anyway, I just want to show you some more examples of copying from the prototype in my modeling. And do I have about 10 more minutes, Jim?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yep.
So, and I already showed you the map of the area. Obviously, if I haven't said it already, I'm basically modeling from Tukwila up to Bellingham in the Seattle region. And so the water is on the left here. So that means south is always to the right and north is to the left. This is a simplified picture. I already showed you the color diagram. So I got some drawings from the Great Northern Railway Historical Society of the actual Interbay Yard in Seattle. And then I flipped it upside down and stuck it against the wall. And then I have my track plan for the main yard. So this is the same yard I showed you a picture of a minute ago being all clogged up. The layout of this yard is taken from the prototype track plan, although certainly condensed. I used to work at the airport for many years, and I would drive by the Lone Star cement plant in South Seattle, and I was always taken with the fact that it had 3 tracks loading cement, from this plant, and a 4th one going off to some other purposes on the other side. So I had to do that. So this is my 3 tracks with a cement silo and this 4th track going off to other purposes on the back. And so that's just, every time I see this, I get a big kick out of it because I know exactly what that looks like. And a lot of other people recognize it as soon as they see it. The Interbay Yard in Seattle has some great overpasses for train watching. And one day I was here and I thought, wait a minute, I have an SD9, I have a switcher, why don't I stage this? So this is my staged version of the exact same situation, except I should have removed those logs from that gondola car. But anyway, I'm just saying you can really have fun modeling the prototype, not only laying out the tracks the right way, but actually copying a picture. And if you follow me at all on Facebook, one of the things that will happen to me is somebody will post a picture from 1973 of a train, and I'll run downstairs and see if I can find the same locomotives and then make a picture of it in HO scale, a copy of the same train that ran. In Interbay, there's a car repair shed 3 bays wide, so I did a little kit bashing to come up with that, a 3 bay wide car repair. And anyway, so that's another example. And it also has a fuel loading area with a tank, and I was able to copy that in the right place in the yard, and we supply the fuel to there. And then eventually we even got the tank built and put in place. And now we're having arguments about the tank because this is the color it is now, but back in 1973, it was a charcoal gray color. So we may have to actually take this out and spray paint it. There's another, sorry, I'm going to go really quick here. I can't tell you every story I want to, but I just want to mention this odd shaped cutout is actually a portal for the train that goes back, the old NP line that went across to Fremont. And so there's actually a switcher that takes some cars over to the South Lake Union area of Seattle that's back here behind this scenery. So that's one of the only examples I've ever seen of an oil tank with trains running right through the middle of it. This is a scene very close to my house where the ocean is just up against a hillside and the double track main line goes north to Everett and then back to you all in the East Coast. And it was one of the things I really wanted to model. So this is the scene on my layout with the same basic situation of lots of foliage, double track main line, and a seawall. I also noticed they had some really cool retaining walls made with old rail and ties, old ties. So just a great way to make a cheap retaining wall, and it's a very easy thing to do. If you got some wood ties stained dark and you've got some old rail, you just cut it up. I think I used some code 55 rail I had here so that it wouldn't look too big, but it looks great, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
So this, what's that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So anyway, this is an example of the same kind of thing up in Everett. There's a big hill. The city is up on top of it there. And they have a yard here called Bayside Yard. And I realized that if I could find the same car, we have modeling from the prototype. Here's the hill. And that's just another example. There's a very important Y called the Delta Y, where if you go to the right, you go to Chicago. If you go to the left, you go up to Vancouver, BC. And so I really wanted to have that. And this is my version. I couldn't quite do the bridge right. And then if you're ever in the Seattle area rail fanning, I encourage you to go to Mount Vernon and look for the Burlington Yard, because this is a 5-track yard on the prototype. And there is still a branch going off to the west. We're looking north here, branch to the west going to a couple of refineries. And then there was a branch east going up into the mountains to a limestone plant and some lumber mills. Anyway, this is my model of the same yard. And it's really fun because this works just the same way as the prototype. We have this track here for the refineries, and you can see it's full of oil tanks. And then over here, we have some fruit packing plants against the wall. And down at the end, there's the concrete branch where we get the cement out of. One of the mountains in the Cascade range is called Mount Index. And I was able to somehow have my son paint this on the backdrop. I'm not this good a painter, but he was. So he took this photo and made the painting on the backdrop, which looks quite a bit like the real Mount Index.
Yeah.
And then there's also a famous rail fanning trestle on the BN main line near Stevens Pass. So I made one of these microengineering trestles to try to imitate this and put a couple of these on here. Now, the sticklers among you, if there are any, will point out that this is not a 1973 era car here, but that's all right. That's the photo I have. One of my model railroad friends and inspirations models the 1895 period, and he really loved this photograph. And so on his HO layout, he made an almost exact replica of it, which just took my breath away every time I saw it. And I just wanted to show you this because modeling from prototype photos and scenes is really fun. Whoops, sorry. Oh, I didn't realize I could advance with my... So another quick point is the more you learn about how the prototype railroad operated it, the more fun you can have. This is something called the train ship, which was a special train that went up to a barge service in Vancouver that took fresh produce to Alaska. And so twice a week, they would run this special reefer train. And so that's what we do on the layout. We get a bunch of reefers. It's a very high priority train on a schedule because that boat that went to Alaska was going to leave at a certain time. And that's something I would never know about except, doing research on how the prototype operated. Also, there was copper ore that came down to a smelter in Tacoma, and I absolutely love ore jennies. And I was dejected because I couldn't model that here in Seattle until I found out that they used to use ore jennies for that copper ore, and back in the 70s. So we run lots of ore jennies here with a big smile on my face. I mentioned the Boeing plant. One of them is up near Everett, and it has a 5% grade. And in order to handle that, they had to rebuild some Jeeps with special oil sumps because it was so steep they didn't want the engine to run out of oil pressure. So anyway, I went ahead and put the decals on here so that we would have number 1799. And this locomotive is the one that always handles the Boeing job up that 5% grade.
Huh.
I think I'm out of time. I just want to mention that in the 70s, the railroad started computerizing their car handling, and they used something that started out with the Southern Pacific Industrial Numbering System, and then Burlington Northern took it over as the Shippers Perpetual. And what they do is they have codes for every switch and zones, and they coded every waybill for these computer codes. So anyway, I set something like that up for the railroad. And just to show you an example, I have number 1822, means zone 18 and track 22. And then you can see I've got the switch labeled 1822, and then the car card for that car is also labeled 1822, right on this waybill. And I also have interchanges with the Milwaukee and the UP, and I won't talk about this. And the last thing, or the most recent thing we're doing is to start modeling the West Seattle Bethlehem Steel Mill. And this is just a stand-in for starters. We will be, when I get the switches in, we'll be shipping scrap in this side and taking the rebar out from this side. But eventually I plan to do a larger shelf with a closer replica of the West Seattle Mill, which is a fascinating subject in itself. And last, I just wanted to show that it's true that I do have a narrow gauge branch. There's no excuse for it. It's just a complete indulgence. But here, my theory is that the DNRGW from Colorado eventually in the 70s expanded all the way out to Everett in order to compete with the standard gauge railroads. And that was the 7th division. So this is the 7th division of the DRGW. It terminates here in Everett, but we send narrow gauge trains back towards Denver. And this is the farthest we get, which is somewhere in Idaho. And that's our east staging up here. And we have a town up here. But fortunately, this is at my eye level, and I'm 6'5", so nobody basically pays any attention to this. I just have it so I can play with narrow gauge equipment. And of course, we can't end without mentioning cabooses, can we? I mean, that's the other big advantage of 1973 is everybody was still required to have a caboose on their train. And they, of course, all had a bunch of different colors too. So I have at least 3 or 4 times more cabooses than a normal person would need, as well as locomotives. So anyway, that's my story. I'm sticking to it. It only took me 35 years to get to this point. So don't be discouraged if you're just starting with a layout. You just keep at it. That's all I can say. And I have this YouTube channel called Much Fun with Trains. And I've got about 400 videos of all kinds of operations and models and different things we've been doing. And that has become also a very obsessive sub-hobby. So anyway, that's it. Do you have any questions? Do you have any time for questions? No?
Yeah. Anybody got any questions for Burr? Burr, I tell you, the thing that impresses me the most, I guess, is how true to the prototype you actually do your modeling. You know, I've had other people talk about prototypes and that kind of thing, but nobody that I'm aware of goes into the kind of depth and tries to create the realism that you do on your model railroad. I think it's wonderful.
Well, the key is to try to make friends with people who used to work on the railroad, because that's how I get a lot of information. You know, they say, oh, no, we didn't do it that way. We did it that way. So, okay, fine. We'll do it that way then, if you say so. The big, as you know, the big advantage to proto freelance modeling is you don't have to make stuff up yourself. You can just copy whatever other people tell you they did. You don't have to design anything.
Right. Well, listen, I'm going to be in contact with you because I do want you back. I'd love to be able to talk about when prototype stops being fun. I think that could be a great discussion and something that you don't normally hear people talk about, particularly if they're trying to be prototype modelers. So, Burr, thanks so very much for your time this evening. We really do appreciate it.
All right, you're welcome.